The Allies could lose battles and still win the war. Part 1. The Triumph of Inferior Forces. In September 1939, when Nazi Germany invaded Poland, the strategic situation appeared to favor the Allies in almost every measurable way. Great Britain and France possessed industrial economies that, when combined, exceeded German productive capacity. The British Empire controlled vast territories across multiple continents, providing access to raw materials and natural resources. France possessed the largest standing army in continental Europe. The Soviet Union, when added to the equation after Germany's invasion in 1941, brought an enormous population and vast territories rich in resources. Yet this numerical and material superiority translated into something entirely different on the battlefield. The disparity between the Allies' theoretical advantages and their actual performance in combat created one of history's most perplexing paradoxes. How could nations with superior resources suffer so many military defeats at the hands of an opponent with fewer resources? The Wehrmacht, the German military establishment, possessed qualities that seemed to transcend the conventional measurements of military power. The German army was superbly organized, rigorously trained, and led by officers who possessed a level of tactical and operational sophistication that their counterparts in other nations struggled to match. German soldiers, indoctrinated in the Nazi ideology and hardened by the experiences of military service, demonstrated discipline and courage that impressed even those who opposed them. The Wehrmacht had developed new concepts of warfare that previous military generations had only theorized about. The German military victory over France in the spring of 1940 remains one of the most shocking military outcomes in history. The reverberations of that defeat still echo through discussions of military affairs and strategy. France entered the campaign with numerical advantages in several categories. French industry was comparable to German industry. The Maginot Line, an enormous system of fortifications stretching along the Franco-German border, was considered one of the most sophisticated defensive structures ever built. French military tradition stretched back centuries. French officers prided themselves on military professionalism and cultural sophistication. Yet in the span of 6 weeks, from May to June 1940, the German army crushed the French military and forced the French government to accept surrender. The French army, despite its size and the strength of its fortifications, was defeated so completely and so rapidly that it never recovered from the initial shock. German forces exploited a breakthrough in the supposedly impenetrable Maginot Line, swept through Belgium and the Netherlands, and circled around the main French defensive positions. The entire French army was either captured, destroyed, or scattered in flight. The speed and decisiveness of the German victory was attributed to a military doctrine that the Germans called BLITZKRIEG, lightning war. This was not merely a tactical approach to combat. Blitzkrieg was a comprehensive operational doctrine that integrated multiple arms of the military into a coordinated system of warfare. Tanks, aircraft, infantry, and artillery were orchestrated to work in synchronization, each element supporting the others. German forces moved rapidly, struck with concentrated power at selected points of weakness, and maintained momentum while enemy forces were still disorganized. The doctrine required something beyond mere military hardware. It required precision in planning, sophisticated communication systems, officers who could exercise initiative without constant supervision, and soldiers trained to understand their role within the larger tactical framework. The Wehrmacht possessed these qualities. The French army, despite its size and resources, did not. Blitzkrieg was possible because the Germans had invested enormous effort in developing a military doctrine that emphasized speed, concentration of force, and the integration of different types of weapons. The Germans had studied the lessons of the First World War and had concluded that victory in modern warfare would require mobility and coordination rather than the static trench warfare that had characterized the previous conflict. This intellectual preparation, combined with superior training and organization, gave the German military an edge that appeared insurmountable. The achievements of the Wehrmacht in the early years of the war were remarkable. After the defeat of France, German forces turned eastward and prepared to invade the Soviet Union. In June 1941, German armies crossed into Soviet territory. The invasion was on a scale that dwarfed previous campaigns. The entire Western Front during the First World War had stretched for perhaps 400 miles. The German invasion front in the Soviet Union stretched for nearly 2,000 miles, from the Baltic to the Black Sea. German forces advanced at an extraordinary pace. In the first weeks of the invasion, German troops penetrated deep into Soviet territory, capturing vast areas and inflicting catastrophic losses on the Soviet army. Soviet forces, caught unprepared and suffering from the purges that Stalin had inflicted on the officer corps, were defeated in battle after battle. Soviet soldiers surrendered in such vast numbers that the Germans struggled to process the prisoners. By October 1941, German forces had advanced more than 1,000 miles into Soviet territory. German troops stood before Moscow, Leningrad, and other major Soviet cities. Victory seemed within reach. German planners believed that the Soviet Union could be defeated before winter set in, before the German army became bogged down in a prolonged campaign against a vast enemy. Yet even as German armies achieved these military victories, a profound strategic problem was becoming apparent. Germany possessed a military establishment that could defeat any opponent in tactical combat. German forces could win battles, could advance hundreds of miles, could inflict enormous casualties on enemy armies. But Germany could not indefinitely sustain this level of military activity. Germany did not possess the industrial capacity to replace losses on a large scale. Germany did not have access to sufficient raw materials to support a prolonged war across multiple theaters. The fundamental issue was one of economic scale. The German economy, despite rapid expansion under Nazi direction, was substantially smaller than the American economy, smaller than the Soviet economy in terms of population and territory, and dependent on imports for critical raw materials that Britain and the Allies attempted to prevent from reaching Germany through naval blockade. Germany's strategy was not based on the assumption that the Nazis could build an industrial establishment equal to that of their opponents. German strategy was based on the assumption that German military superiority would allow Germany to win wars quickly before the superior economic resources of potential enemies could be mobilized for military purposes. This was the strategic logic behind the invasion of the Soviet Union. Germany had to defeat the Soviet Union quickly before the vast resources of Soviet territory and Soviet population could be organized for military production. Similarly, the strategy underlying Germany's attack on the Soviet Union was based on the assessment that a quick victory was possible because the German army possessed superior tactical and operational skill. The Wehrmacht could defeat the Soviet army in open combat. German forces could advance rapidly and capture territory before Soviet forces could organize effective resistance. This strategic logic was not unreasonable. It was based on careful analysis of military capabilities and on the historical evidence of German military superiority. The Allies in 1939, 1940, and 1941 were not producing superior military forces. British forces in North Africa were defeated by a smaller German force under Erwin Rommel. Greek forces were defeated by German invaders. Yugoslav forces offered only brief resistance before being overwhelmed. Soviet forces, despite their enormous size, were defeated in virtually every major engagement in the early months of the invasion. The Allies appeared to be losing the war militarily. there seemed to be no military force capable of defeating the Wehrmacht in a direct confrontation. German tactical skill and operational competence appeared to be overwhelming. Yet beneath the surface of these military victories, a different story was unfolding. In 1939, the industrial resources available to the Allies vastly exceeded those available to Germany. When France fell, the immediate balance shifted in Germany's favor. Britain stood alone, but Britain possessed enormous resources in the form of its empire, its navy, and its alliance with other nations, particularly the United States and the Soviet Union. The United States was not yet at war in 1939, 1940, and 1941. But President Franklin D. Roosevelt understood that American security was connected to the survival of Britain and the defeat of Nazi Germany. The Lend-Lease program, initiated in 1941, allowed the United States to provide weapons, supplies, and military equipment to Britain, and eventually to the Soviet Union. This assistance was crucial to sustaining British military efforts and to preparing the Soviet Union for the enormous war effort that would be required to defeat Germany. The British military, while defeated in certain campaigns, was not destroyed. The British Army in North Africa, though defeated by Rommel's forces, continued to exist and continued to contest control of the Mediterranean. The Royal Navy remained a formidable force, protecting British islands from invasion and threatening German commerce. The British Air Force, the Royal Air Force, defeated the German Luftwaffe in the Battle of Britain in 1940, preventing German invasion and demonstrating that German military forces could be successfully opposed. The Soviet Union, despite the catastrophic losses in the early months of the invasion, was beginning to mobilize its enormous resources for the war. Soviet factories were being evacuated eastward, beyond the reach of German occupation. Soviet military production was beginning to increase. Soviet soldiers, despite having suffered millions of casualties, were continuing to fight. What was becoming apparent, though not yet fully evident, was that the Allies possessed a strategic advantage that no amount of tactical skill could overcome. The Allies could replace their losses. When a British battalion was defeated in battle, new soldiers could be conscripted and trained to replace losses. When Soviet forces suffered millions of casualties, millions more conscripts could be mobilized from the Soviet population. When American ships were sunk, American shipyards could build more ships. Germany could not match this. The German population was limited. German industry, despite rapid expansion, had limits to how much military equipment could be produced. German access to raw materials was constrained by the Allied naval blockade and by the requirements of the occupation forces that Germany had to maintain across conquered territories. In 1939, this strategic asymmetry was not obvious. German military victories seemed to suggest that military superiority would determine the outcome of the war. German forces seemed capable of defeating any opponent that accepted battle. It appeared that the war would be determined by military campaigns and tactical victories. But the Allies possessed something that was less visible, but ultimately more powerful than tactical superiority. The Allies possessed industrial capacity, natural resources, and access to additional resources through trade and alliance. As long as the war did not end quickly in a German victory, as long as the war developed into a prolonged conflict, the Allies' superior resources would eventually assert themselves. This was not understood by German planners. German leaders believed that they possessed the military capability to win quickly. They believed that the German army could defeat all opponents, could occupy Soviet territory, and could establish a German empire stretching from the Atlantic to the Urals. German strategy was predicated on quick, decisive victories that would prevent the mobilization of enemy resources. But the German invasion of the Soviet Union did not achieve quick victory. the war became prolonged. And once the war became prolonged, once it became clear that the conflict would extend beyond the few months that German planners had anticipated, the outcome began to be determined by industrial capacity and resource availability, rather than by military skill. The Allies could lose battles and still win the war because they could afford to lose battles in ways that the Axis powers could not. A defeat in a single campaign did not threaten the Allies' ability to continue fighting. A loss of territory did not threaten the Allies' access to resources. Even catastrophic military defeats did not prevent the Allies from regrouping, reorganizing, and returning to the offensive. The Germans could not afford the same luxury. Each German defeat consumed irreplaceable resources. Each German soldier lost was removed from a finite pool of manpower. Each German tank destroyed had to be replaced from German production capacity, which was limited. German strategy required continuous success. A prolonged stalemate or a series of tactical defeats would gradually exhaust German resources and leave Germany unable to sustain the war. By the end of 1941, this fundamental strategic reality was becoming apparent to careful observers, though many military leaders and political figures did not yet grasp the implications. The Allies had not won any overwhelming military victories. The Allies were still losing battles in many theaters, yet the Allies were beginning to reorganize, to mobilize their resources, and to prepare for a prolonged conflict that would eventually favor those with superior resources. The German military, for all its tactical brilliance and organizational superiority, was fighting an opponent that could not be defeated through military means alone. The Allies could be defeated in battles. They could not be defeated in a prolonged war of attrition. Part 2. The limits of Blitzkrieg. The German strategy in the Second World War was fundamentally sound, given the constraints that Germany faced. German military planners understood with perfect clarity that Germany could not construct a military establishment equal in size or resources to that of the Soviet Union or the United States. Germany was geographically smaller. Germany possessed fewer natural resources. Germany had a smaller population from which to draw soldiers. Germany's economy, despite the rapid rearmament undertaken by the Nazi regime, could not match the productive capacity of larger nations. Given these inescapable realities, German strategy had to compensate for quantitative inferiority through qualitative superiority. Germany would not attempt to match the Soviet Union or the United States in raw production. Instead, Germany would build a military force of exceptional quality, superior organization, and innovative doctrine. This military force would be concentrated at decisive points to achieve overwhelming local superiority. The strategy would rely on speed, surprise, and the defeat of enemy forces before those forces could mobilize their superior total resources. The Blitzkrieg doctrine perfectly embodied this strategic insight. Blitzkrieg was not a mere tactical approach or a temporary aberration in military affairs. Blitzkrieg was the considered response of military professionals to a strategic problem that had no conventional solution. Germany could not win by matching the Allies in a prolonged, attrition-based conflict. Therefore, Germany would have to win through rapid, decisive campaigns that eliminated enemy capacity to fight before industrial mobilization could level the playing field. This strategy succeeded magnificently against Poland in 1939. The Polish army, though brave and resolute, was equipped with cavalry units and antiquated weapons. The German army, equipped with modern tanks and supported by aircraft, defeated Polish forces in a matter of weeks. The strategic objective, the conquest of Poland, was achieved before any other great power could intervene effectively. Blitzkrieg succeeded spectacularly against France in 1940. The French army, despite its size and the sophistication of its fortifications, was defeated in 6 weeks. German forces, concentrated at a critical point, pierced the French defensive line at Sedan. German panzer divisions poured through the breach, rapidly advancing westward toward the English Channel. By the time the French military leadership understood what had occurred, the German army had already encircled their primary forces. Rapid movement and concentration of force had achieved what appeared to be a permanent military victory. Blitzkrieg achieved significant successes against Yugoslavia and Greece in 1941. German forces advanced rapidly, defeated numerically superior enemy forces, and achieved their political objectives in a matter of weeks. The pattern seemed consistent. Wherever the Germans applied the Blitzkrieg doctrine against enemies who lacked the capacity to respond with equivalent speed and coordination, German forces achieved overwhelming victory. But the strategy encountered a fundamental obstacle when Germany invaded the Soviet Union on June 22, 1941. The Soviet Union was not Poland or France or Yugoslavia. The Soviet Union was vast. The distance from the western border of the Soviet Union to Moscow was approximately 1,000 miles. The distance from the western border to the Caucasus, where German forces hoped to capture oil fields, was even greater. The total territory of the Soviet Union covered millions of square miles. A nation so vast could not be defeated in a single campaign. Even if German forces achieved complete tactical victories and advanced hundreds of miles, they would not have achieved the complete defeat of their opponent. The Soviet Union stretched across multiple time zones and possessed enormous internal resources and population that could be mobilized for military purposes regardless of how much territory Germany conquered. German military planners understood this problem. The strategy for the invasion of the Soviet Union was based on the belief that the war could be won within a limited time frame. Most planning assumed victory within 4 to 6 months, certainly before the onset of winter. German forces would advance rapidly, destroy the Soviet army in the western portions of the Soviet Union, occupy the most economically productive regions, and force the Soviet government to surrender. The strategy assumed that if Germany could win within a few months, it would not matter that Germany lacked the resources to sustain a prolonged campaign. The entire point of the invasion was to achieve victory quickly, before the Soviet Union could mobilize its full industrial and manpower potential. In the opening weeks of Operation Barbarossa, as the German invasion was codenamed, German forces appeared to be on the verge of achieving this objective. German panzer divisions advanced at extraordinary speed. Soviet forces, caught largely unprepared, were defeated in a series of battles. The German army captured enormous quantities of territory and prisoners. Soviet losses in the opening months of the invasion were catastrophic. Estimates of Soviet casualties in 1941 and the first part of 1942 exceed 4 million soldiers, killed, wounded, or captured. Yet despite these losses, despite the advanced positions of German forces, despite the apparent imminence of German victory, the Soviet Union did not surrender. The Soviet government, led by Joseph Stalin, determined to continue the war. The Soviet military, despite suffering the most devastating losses in its history, continued to organize new armies and mount new offensives. The fundamental problem facing Germany was that the Soviet Union's response to the invasion was not a conventional one. Rather than attempting to defend all of its territory, the Soviet Union adopted a strategy of strategic retreat. Soviet factories were evacuated eastward, moved beyond the reach of German occupation. Entire industrial plants, machinery, workers, blueprints, were transported on railroad cars to locations in the Urals, Central Asia, and Siberia. The disruption to Soviet production was severe, but the Soviet Union was preparing for a prolonged war. By the autumn of 1941, it was becoming clear that the Blitzkrieg strategy had failed. The German army had not achieved the quick victory upon which the entire strategy depended. German forces were bogged down in a prolonged campaign against a vast enemy. The weather was deteriorating. Winter was approaching. German supply lines were stretched to their limits, over thousands of miles of conquered territory. The German failure to capture Moscow in the autumn of 1941 marked the decisive moment. The German army launched an assault on the Soviet capital, hoping to achieve a quick victory before winter. But Soviet forces, despite their losses, managed to hold the city. German forces reached the suburbs of Moscow, but could not break through to the city center. As winter arrived, German forces, equipped for a brief summer campaign, found themselves facing not only a determined enemy, but also the brutal Russian winter. The failure at Moscow was not merely a tactical setback, it was the death of the entire German strategy. Blitzkrieg depended on achieving a decisive victory within months. Once it became clear that the war would extend into 1942 and beyond, the fundamental mathematics of the conflict shifted irrevocably. Germany was no longer fighting a war of rapid conquest. Germany was engaged in a prolonged conflict of attrition against an opponent with vastly superior resources. This was the worst possible outcome for Germany. The entire point of German strategy was to avoid a war of attrition with the Soviet Union. A prolonged conflict would allow the Soviet Union to mobilize its superior resources. A war of attrition would favor the opponent with greater capacity to replace losses. A long war would allow the United States, now entering the war following the Japanese attack on Pearl Harbor in December 1941, to mobilize its industrial capacity. Yet this was precisely the situation that Germany now faced. The war was becoming prolonged. The United States was entering the conflict with its enormous economic potential. The Soviet Union, despite suffering losses that would have destroyed smaller nations, was reorganizing and preparing for a prolonged struggle. The Eastern Front, after the failure at Moscow, became a war of attrition on a scale that was almost inconceivable. German forces continued to advance, continued to win tactical victories, continued to inflict enormous losses on Soviet forces. German generals repeatedly reported that the Soviet army was broken, defeated, incapable of further organized resistance. Yet the Soviet army continued to exist, continued to fight, continued to inflict casualties on German forces. The fundamental problem was that Germany could not replace its losses. The German population provided a finite pool of military manpower. As casualties mounted, the pool was depleted. German industry produced equipment as rapidly as possible, but it could not match the rates of loss in a prolonged campaign. German access to raw materials was constrained. German economy, despite increased military expenditure, had limits to its productive capacity. The Soviet Union, despite suffering losses that vastly exceeded German losses, had a larger population from which to draw replacements. Soviet industry, relocated eastward and protected from German occupation, was beginning to increase production. Soviet losses in 1941 and early 1942 were catastrophic, but the Soviet Union had not been defeated economically. The means to continue the war still existed. The Battle of Stalingrad, which began in August 1942 and continued through February 1943, became the symbol and culmination of the Eastern Front's transformation from blitzkrieg to attrition warfare. German forces attacked the city seeking to capture it and advanced to the Caucasus oil fields. Soviet forces, under orders from Stalin to hold the city at all costs, resisted with desperate determination. The battle was fought street by street, building by building, through the ruined industrial city. German forces advanced slowly, inflicting enormous casualties on the Soviet defenders. For months, the outcome seemed uncertain. German forces seemed on the verge of complete victory. Yet the Soviets continued sending reinforcements, continued fighting, continued absorbing casualties. The critical difference was that the Soviets could afford to sustain these casualties. Soviet factories, protected in the Urals and Siberia, were producing new guns, new tanks, new ammunition. Soviet conscription systems could raise new armies to replace losses. The Soviet Union had a vast hinterland into which it could withdraw forces and prepare new offensives. Germany could not afford to sustain such casualties. German losses at Stalingrad were replacement losses that Germany could not afford. The German Sixth Army, trapped in the city by a Soviet encirclement in November 1942, consisted of approximately 300,000 soldiers. When the battle ended in February 1943, approximately 200,000 of those soldiers were dead, wounded, or captured. Germany never fully recovered from this loss. Stalingrad was the turning point not because it was the final German defeat or the greatest German loss. Stalingrad was the turning point because it demonstrated the fundamental truth of the Eastern Front. Germany could not win a war of attrition against the Soviet Union. When battles became contests of who could absorb more losses and sustain them longer, Germany would lose because Germany did not have the capacity to replace losses that the Soviet Union possessed. After Stalingrad, the strategic initiative on the Eastern Front passed to the Soviet Union. German forces would continue to fight, would continue to achieve tactical victories, would continue to inflict enormous casualties on Soviet forces. German military skill remained evident throughout 1943, 1944, and 1945. German soldiers continued to demonstrate courage and discipline. But Germany was no longer capable of winning the war in the East. Germany could perhaps hope to slow the Soviet advance, to reduce Soviet success rates, but could not prevent the eventual defeat. Germany's strategic defeat was assured by the mathematics of attrition. The Soviet Union had more soldiers, more factories, more capacity to sustain the war. Once the conflict became a war of attrition, the outcome was inevitable. The United States' entry into the war in December 1941 sealed Germany's fate. American industrial capacity, combined with British and Soviet resources, was vastly superior to Axis capacity. Germany was now fighting a coalition of opponents with combined resources that far exceeded German resources. The strategy of quick victory through concentrated military superiority had failed. Germany was trapped in exactly the kind of prolonged conflict that German strategy had been designed to avoid. The Blitzkrieg doctrine had failed not because the doctrine was flawed or because German forces were not capable of executing it effectively. The doctrine failed because it encountered an opponent and circumstances that were beyond its capacity to overcome. The Soviet Union was too large, too resourceful, and too determined to be defeated by rapid military conquest. Once that became clear, once it was evident that the war would be prolonged, the outcome began to be determined by factors other than military skill and tactical superiority. Germany's fate was sealed in the winter of 1941-1942, when the failure at Moscow and the continuing Soviet resistance demonstrated that Blitzkrieg could not achieve the quick victory upon which German strategy depended. What followed was not the final chapter of a war, but merely the slow working out of a conclusion that had already been determined. Germany would continue to fight, would continue to inflict casualties, would continue to achieve tactical victories. But Germany could not win. The mathematics of industrial production and resource management had already decided the war's outcome. Part 3. The machinery of industrial war. The Second World War was fundamentally different from all previous conflicts in human history. It was the first truly total war, a conflict in which the outcome was not determined merely by the skill of commanders, the courage of soldiers, or the tactical victories achieved in specific battles and campaigns. The Second World War was decided by the ability of entire nations to mobilize their resources, their factories, their raw materials, their transportation networks, their human labor, and transform those resources into military equipment at the scale required to sustain a global conflict. This transformation was not automatic or inevitable. It required conscious decisions by political and military leadership. It required the disruption of civilian economic life. It required the reorganization of entire societies around the single purpose of waging war. It required the mobilization of populations who had never expected to serve in the military. It required the acceptance of government control over economic activity on a scale that would have been unthinkable in peacetime. The United States, in particular, underwent an economic transformation of extraordinary scope and speed. In 1941, before American entry into the war, the American aircraft industry was producing fewer than 3,500 military aircraft annually. This figure was considered respectable for peacetime military production. President Franklin D. Roosevelt, in a speech to Congress in January 1942, called for the production of 60,000 aircraft in 1942 and 125,000 in 1943. He also called for the production of 45,000 tanks and 20 million tons of shipping. The reaction from the American military and industrial establishment was skeptical to the point of disbelief. The targets seemed impossible. The American aircraft industry could not possibly increase production by a factor of 40 or 50 times. The demands appeared to be propaganda, a rhetorical gesture toward the scale of the war effort, rather than a realistic statement of production capabilities. Yet American industry, over the next 3 years, came close to matching Roosevelt's goals. By the end of the war, American factories had produced approximately 300,000 military aircraft, a 90-fold increase over pre-war production levels. American shipyards, as documented in the Liberty Ship program, built nearly 3,000 merchant vessels plus thousands of military ships. American factories produced over 1 million tanks and countless other vehicles. American production of ammunition, weapons, explosives, and supplies seemed almost limitless. The transformation of the American economy was unprecedented in scope and speed. Automobile factories that had produced cars for the civilian market were converted to tank production. The Ford Motor Company's River Rouge plant, one of the largest industrial facilities in the world, shifted much of its production from automobiles to aircraft engines and military equipment. Appliance manufacturers that had produced refrigerators and stoves began producing weapons and military equipment. Textile mills that had produced civilian clothing shifted to producing uniforms and military supplies. Furniture factories produced military supplies. The transformation extended beyond manufacturing. American railroad capacity was reorganized to transport military supplies. American farmers increased production to feed both the American military and the Soviet Union through Lend-Lease. American mines increased production of copper, zinc, aluminum, and other metals. American refineries increased petroleum production. Every sector of the American economy was affected by the mobilization for war. The American labor force underwent reorganization as well. Millions of workers shifted from civilian employment to military production. Unemployment, which had been persistent during the Great Depression, disappeared as factories operated at full capacity. New workers entered the labor force who had never worked before. Women entered factories in unprecedented numbers, performing welding, riveting, assembly, and countless other tasks. Retirees returned to work. Young people entered factories instead of attending college or pursuing other careers. The transformation of the American workforce was symbolized by the image of Rosie the Riveter, the strong woman worker riveting aircraft fuselages and ships. The image became iconic, representing the contribution of American women to the war effort. By the end of the war, women comprised roughly 30% of the defense industry workforce. Women earned wages that far exceeded what was available in peacetime employment, yet worked under conditions that were often dangerous and exhausting. The American transformation was possible because of several advantages that other nations did not possess. American territory was secure from invasion. American industrial facilities were not bombed by enemy air forces until very late in the war, and even then, only American aircraft attacking enemy targets occasionally returned damaged or lost. American access to raw materials was protected by the Atlantic and Pacific Oceans. American technological knowledge, developed in universities and private industry over decades, provided the foundation for advanced military equipment. But the transformation was not merely a matter of existing advantages. It required government intervention in the economy on a massive scale. The federal government established the War Production Board, which set production priorities and allocated resources. The government negotiated contracts with private manufacturers. The government provided financing for the expansion of production capacity. The government imposed price controls and rationing to prevent inflation and ensure fair distribution of scarce resources. The transformation required the acceptance of government control that would have been politically impossible in peacetime. American businesses, while maintaining private ownership and profit incentives, operated under government direction. Labor unions, while continuing to represent workers, generally cooperated with the war effort rather than engaging in strikes and work stoppages. The American government, while maintaining democratic institutions, achieved a degree of control over economic activity that approached the control exercised by totalitarian regimes. The Soviet Union faced a different but equally impressive mobilization challenge. The Soviet Union was invaded in June 1941 and lost vast territories to German occupation. Yet the Soviet Union evacuated its industrial base eastward, moved factories beyond the reach of German occupation, and prepared for a prolonged war. Soviet industrial production, despite the disruptions caused by evacuation and the loss of territories, eventually increased dramatically. Soviet production of tanks became extraordinary. The Soviet Union produced approximately 80,000 tanks during the war, more than double the German production. Soviet production of artillery exceeded German production by even larger margins. Soviet production of aircraft, though qualitatively inferior to German and American aircraft in many respects, was quantitatively enormous. The Soviet Union produced approximately 158,000 aircraft during the war. The Soviet mobilization occurred under conditions of extreme hardship. Soviet soldiers were often inadequately equipped and trained. Soviet workers operated in factories under harsh conditions. The Soviet Union accepted enormous casualties in combat because the Soviet government was willing to sacrifice manpower to achieve its military objectives. The Soviet strategy was one of attrition, using superior numbers and production capacity to overwhelm German resistance. Britain, despite being bombed and blockaded, also underwent industrial mobilization. British aircraft production increased. British tank production increased. British production of weapons and supplies increased. Britain did not match American or Soviet production levels, but Britain managed to sustain its armed forces and to support military campaigns across multiple theaters of war. The gap between Allied production and Axis production widened dramatically as the war progressed. In 1939, German production was not significantly lower than British production. By 1943, British production exceeded German production in many categories. American production, added to the equation, exceeded German production by factors of many times. By 1944, the Allies were producing more military equipment than the Axis could produce by a margin so vast that it was difficult to calculate. American aircraft production alone exceeded German production by a factor of 3 or 4. British production added to American production created an overwhelming advantage. Soviet production, while focused on fewer types of equipment, was quantitatively enormous. The mathematics of military production were relentless. This production gap meant that the Allies could afford to lose equipment and personnel at rates that would devastate smaller nations. When an American regiment suffered casualties, it could be reinforced with replacements. When an American tank was destroyed, American factories could produce more. When an American ship was sunk, American shipyards could build more ships. This capacity to replace losses extended to personnel as well. The United States had a policy of rotating soldiers home after a certain number of months of combat, typically between 20 and 30 months, depending on the theater. This meant that experienced American soldiers could be removed from combat, sent home, and replaced with trained replacements. The policy created disruption to military units, but maintained morale and spread the burden of combat across the American population. Germany could not afford such policies. German soldiers typically served until they were killed, wounded beyond recovery, or captured. Once a German soldier was removed from service due to wounds, the German army struggled to find trained replacements. The German replacement system gradually became inadequate to the demands of continuous combat. The strategic air campaign against Germany illustrated this principle of production-driven warfare. The Allies, primarily the United States and Britain, began bombing German cities and industrial facilities in 1942 and intensified the campaign through 1943 and 1944. The bombing killed hundreds of thousands of German civilians, destroyed German cities, and disrupted German industrial production. But the bombing did not prevent Germany from increasing production of weapons and ammunition. German factories, dispersed across the territory of Germany and occupied Europe, continued to produce military equipment even as bombing intensified. German tank production actually increased in 1943 and 1944 compared to earlier years. German aircraft production continued, though under increasingly difficult circumstances. What the bombing did achieve was to force Germany to allocate enormous resources to air defense. German fighter aircraft production consumed resources that might have been used for other military purposes. German anti-aircraft guns, which could have been employed against ground targets, had to be devoted to home defense. German workers had to repair bomb damage rather than produce new equipment. German military command had to divert fighter aircraft from other theaters to defend the home territory. The critical point was that the Allies could sustain a bombing campaign indefinitely, while Germany could not. American aircraft production could replace bombing losses. German aircraft production could not. American pilot training programs could produce replacement pilots faster than they were being lost. German pilot training programs could not keep pace with German fighter losses. Every aspect of the war, once it became a prolonged conflict, favored the Allies. The Allies had superior capacity to produce weapons. The Allies had superior capacity to produce ammunition. The Allies had superior capacity to produce vehicles, ships, and equipment. The Allies had superior capacity to produce food and supplies. When one side can produce more of everything than the other side, attrition warfare inevitably favors the side with superior production. This was the fundamental equation of the Second World War. The Allies could afford to lose battles, to make mistakes, to pursue inefficient strategies because they could replace their losses. The Axis powers could not. By 1943, this reality was becoming apparent to military planners on both sides. German military leaders understood that Germany could not match Allied production. German generals proposed strategies focused on slowing the Allied advance, reducing Allied casualty-inflicting power, and hoping for a negotiated peace. But the Allies had committed to unconditional surrender as a war aim. There would be no negotiated peace. The Axis powers had gambled that they could win through rapid military conquests, achieved before the Allies could fully mobilize their superior resources. The gamble had failed. The war had become prolonged. The machinery of industrial production had begun to assert itself over the machinery of military tactics. And the machinery of industrial production favored the Allies in almost every category. The outcome, though not yet fully determined in 1943, was becoming increasingly inevitable. Part 4. The Inexorable Mathematics. By the time the Allies launched their invasion of Normandy on June 6, 1944, the outcome of the Second World War was already predetermined by the mathematics of industrial production and resource management. This was not apparent to soldiers preparing for the invasion, nor to commanders planning the assault, nor to the millions of civilians watching developments from their homes. Many people feared that the invasion might fail, that the German army might defeat the Allied forces attempting to establish a beachhead in France. Yet to anyone who understood the fundamental equation of the war, that the Allies possessed superior productive capacity and could replace losses while the Axis powers could not. The outcome was no longer in doubt. The invasion of Normandy was not a desperate gamble in which one side might win and another might lose. The invasion was the implementation of a strategy that had already been decided by factors that transcended the individual battles and campaigns of the war. The invasion of Normandy required unprecedented quantities of military resources. The Allies assembled nearly 3 million soldiers in England, organized into armies prepared for combat in France. The Allies accumulated supplies, ammunition, fuel, food, medical supplies, spare parts, in quantities so vast that ports from Cornwall to Wales were jammed with material waiting to be transported across the English Channel. The Allies built or converted thousands of ships and landing craft. The landing craft were not technological marvels. They were simple vessels, many of them wooden, designed to carry soldiers and light equipment to beaches and then withdraw. Some landing craft carried tanks, others carried artillery, still others carried engineers and supplies. The design was straightforward and unglamorous. What mattered was not technological sophistication, but the sheer number of vessels available. The preparation for the invasion lasted months. Supplies were accumulated in depots across southern England. Soldiers trained in assault tactics. Officers planned the operation in meticulous detail. The accumulation of resources was so enormous that it could not be hidden from German intelligence. The Germans knew that an invasion was coming. The only question was where and when. From a purely military standpoint, the invasion of Normandy was not characterized by technological superiority. The tanks used in the invasion, primarily the American M4 Sherman, were inferior in armor and firepower to German tanks like the Panther and Tiger. The German army, fighting on defensive terrain, possessed tactical advantages. German soldiers, fighting on their selected ground with prepared defensive positions, possessed advantages that attacking forces would normally encounter. The Allied advantage was not technological or tactical. The Allied advantage was overwhelming superiority in numbers. The Allies could bring more soldiers, more equipment, and more supplies to Normandy than the Germans could concentrate to defend the coast. This superiority in numbers was directly traceable to the superior production capacity of the Allied powers. The initial landings on June 6, 1944, incurred significant casualties. American forces landing at Omaha Beach suffered approximately 2,000 casualties in the first day of combat. Some units suffered losses exceeding 50%. The casualty rates were horrific. Soldiers and officers watched their companions fall. The beach was a place of death and chaos. Yet the Allies could afford these losses. More soldiers were available. More supplies could be brought across the English Channel. More reinforcements could be sent to replace casualties. The American military machine had the capacity to absorb losses at Omaha Beach and still maintain momentum. Within days, the beachhead was secured. Within weeks, the Allies had landed millions of soldiers in Normandy and were beginning to break out from their initial positions. The German military could not afford the losses that the Allies sustained. Every German soldier lost was removed from a finite pool. Every German unit that suffered casualties had to be patched together with whatever replacements could be found. German reserves, which were limited, had to be committed to counterattacks designed to prevent the Allies from establishing a foothold. These counterattacks inflicted casualties on Allied forces, but were themselves destructive to German strength. The Germans could have inflicted greater losses on the Allies. The German army was not decisively defeated at Normandy. German forces fought skillfully. German tactical skill extracted a price from the Allied invaders, but the Germans could not prevent the Allies from landing sufficient forces to establish and expand their beachhead. The Germans did not have the capacity to bring sufficient forces to bear at the critical point. The breakout from Normandy and the subsequent advance across France demonstrated the same principle. German forces, in many engagements, inflicted more casualties on the Allies than the Allies inflicted on the Germans. This was demonstrated repeatedly in the hedgerow fighting of Normandy and in the campaigns in northern France. German defensive tactics were sound. German counterattacks were skillfully executed. Yet the Allies could always bring forward more soldiers, more equipment, and more supplies. An American regiment that suffered 50% casualties could be reinforced and continue the offensive. A German regiment that suffered 50% casualties had no reserves to replace losses. An American division that captured territory could be reinforced to hold the ground and prepare for the next attack. A German division that had been pushed back had only the soldiers remaining to hold the new defensive line. The campaign in France from June through August 1944 was a contest between the German capacity to conduct defense and the Allied capacity to maintain an offensive. Eventually, the Allies won because their capacity to sustain the offensive exceeded the German capacity to sustain the defense. The final collapse of Germany in the spring of 1945 was the inevitable result of this fundamental asymmetry. By the time the final offensive began in 1945, Germany was surrounded. Soviet forces were advancing from the east. American and British forces were advancing from the west. German military forces were exhausted. German cities were in ruins from bombing. German civilians were starving. The German population was in despair. Yet German forces continued to resist. German soldiers and officers, trained in military obedience and Nazi ideology, continued to fight even though the cause was hopeless. German units conducted tactical retreats. German forces launched counterattacks against advancing enemies. The German military establishment continued to function until the very end of the war in May 1945. The final collapse came not from a single catastrophic German defeat, but from the accumulation of defeats, losses, and shortages that gradually made it impossible for Germany to continue the war. Germany could not produce sufficient ammunition. Germany could not fuel its vehicles. Germany could not replace its personnel losses. Germany could not prevent Allied bombing of its cities. Germany could not compete with the Allies in any category of military production. The final German surrender was not primarily a military event. It was the inevitable result of the exhaustion of German resources and the complete mobilization of Allied resources. By May 1945, Germany simply ran out of the capacity to continue fighting. The defeat of Japan followed a similar pattern. Japan had achieved surprise victories in the initial assault on the United States. The Japanese attack on Pearl Harbor on December 7, 1941, had destroyed the American battleship fleet in the Pacific. Japanese forces had conquered vast territories in Southeast Asia and the Pacific. For a brief moment, Japanese military superiority seemed complete. But Japan could not sustain the war against American industrial production. American shipyards built thousands of ships. Japanese shipyards could not match American production. Japanese warships sank by American action were replaced by American construction at rates that dwarfed Japanese replacement capacity. By 1944, the American Navy was vastly superior to the Japanese Navy in total tonnage, aircraft, and trained personnel. American aircraft production exceeded Japanese production by factors of many times. American pilots trained in American pilot training programs could replace losses. Japanese pilots, once lost, could not be replaced. The Japanese pilot training program did not have the capacity to produce sufficient trained pilots to replace combat losses. The island-hopping campaign that brought American forces progressively closer to Japan was possible only because American forces could sustain such a campaign. Each island assault consumed resources. Each assault incurred casualties. Yet American supplies flowed from distant factories seemingly without limit. Japanese forces, isolated on distant islands, faced gradually starvation as American naval forces cut off their supply lines. By the time American forces reached islands close enough to launch air attacks on Japan itself, the outcome was already determined. American aircraft could bomb Japanese cities with increasing intensity. Japanese air defenses were inadequate. Japanese fighter aircraft production could not match American aircraft production. Japanese anti-aircraft guns could not prevent American bombing. The atomic bombs that destroyed Hiroshima on August 6, 1945, and Nagasaki on August 9, 1945, were, in a sense, the final expression of Allied technological and industrial superiority. The atomic bombs were devastating and revolutionary weapons, but they were not the primary reason for Japanese defeat. Japan was already defeated by the mathematics of industrial production. The Japanese government announced Japan's surrender on August 15, 1945. The formal surrender ceremony took place on September 2, 1945, aboard the USS Missouri in Tokyo Bay. The Second World War was officially over. The fundamental lesson of the Second World War was that industrial capacity matters. It matters enormously. Military skill and tactical excellence are valuable attributes, but they cannot indefinitely overcome an opponent with vastly superior resources in a prolonged conflict. The German military was superior to the American military in many respects during the early years of the war. German tactics were more sophisticated. German organization was superior. German soldiers were better trained and more disciplined. Yet Germany lost the war. Germany lost because Germany could not sustain a prolonged conflict against opponents with superior resources. The Allies could afford to make mistakes. The Allies could accept inefficient strategies. The Allies could afford to lose battles and campaigns because they possessed the capacity to absorb losses and continue fighting. The Axis powers could not afford such losses. Every lost soldier was irreplaceable. Every lost piece of equipment had to be produced from limited production capacity. Every lost battle meant fewer resources available for the next battle. The mathematics were inexorable. The Allies could lose battles and still win the war because they possessed superior resources. By 1943, military leaders on both sides understood this fundamental reality. German generals knew that Germany could not win a prolonged war. Japanese military leaders knew that Japan could not defeat the United States in a war of attrition. Yet both nations continued the war, hoping against hope that some miracle would intervene, that the enemy would grow tired of fighting, that a negotiated peace might be possible. No miracle intervened. The enemy did not grow tired. There was no negotiated peace. The war continued to its inevitable conclusion, determined by the mathematics of industrial production. The Second World War validated a principle that transcends military history. Superior resources, organized systematically for a prolonged conflict, will eventually overcome superior tactics and military skill. The principle is not new. Military theorists had recognized it for centuries, but the Second World War demonstrated the principle on an unprecedented scale and with unprecedented clarity. The war also demonstrated that a democratic society, when mobilized for its own defense, possesses advantages over authoritarian societies. The American economy, which was based on private ownership and market principles, was reorganized for war production more effectively than the German economy, which was based on authoritarian control. The transformation was possible because American citizens and American businesses, while accepting government direction and control, understood that they were fighting for their survival. The Allies could lose battles and still win the war. This was not a secret or a surprise. It was the inevitable result of the fundamental conditions of the conflict. The Allies possessed superior resources. The Allies learned to organize those resources effectively. The Allies could afford to sustain the war longer than the Axis powers could sustain it. When these conditions were understood, the outcome was no longer in doubt.